My name is Claire Harmon. I am 34 years old. And by the time my sister raised her plastic wine glass at our family picnic that August evening, I already knew she had been waiting all afternoon to embarrass me. Not because I was paranoid, not because I was looking for a fight, but because I had spent enough years in that family to recognize the particular stillness that settles over a group of people right before someone decides to make another person small. You know the kind of moment I mean. Everybody is smiling too hard. Everybody is chewing too slowly. Everybody can feel something ugly gathering at the edge of the afternoon like a storm nobody wants to name, but nobody says a word. Because somewhere along the way this family decided that wanting a show was more comfortable than wanting peace. That was the air around the folding tables by the lake that evening. Burgers were still smoking on the grill. Children were running through wet grass and bare feet. Cousins were laughing at nothing in particular, the way people do when they are working hard to seem relaxed. And my family was pretending, as it always pretended, at gatherings like this, that we were the kind of people who only ever came together for joy. Then my sister stood up. She tapped the rim of her cup with a fork, the way people do at weddings when they want the room's attention, and she smiled. That smile. The one that always looked generous from across a yard, and devastating up close. Bright and polished and aimed like something sharp. She had practiced that smile for years. She knew exactly what it communicated to different people at different distances. She said, "Here's to the one who always shows up broke, needy, and still hoping to matter." My mother laughed first. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because that is the part that stayed with me the longest. Not my sister's words, not the cousins who followed with their small, cowardly chuckles, because that is what people without spine do when cruelty arrives wearing a confident face. What stayed with me was my mother laughing before she even looked to see how I had received it. Before she checked, before she thought, she just laughed. My father looked down and smiled into his plate. I picked up my drink. I stood slowly, because I had learned by then that slowness reads as power when everyone expects you to either crumble or explode. I looked straight at my sister, and I said, "Then let's raise one to the desperate one, who borrows from the person she mocks, lies about it in front of family, and still expects applause." The whole yard went still, not gradually, all at once, the way a held breath releases in a single moment. My sister's smile dropped at the corners first, then the middle. My father finally looked up from his plate. My mother went pale in a way I'd never seen before. That particular pallor that arrives when a person realizes the version of events they have been curating is about to be replaced by a more accurate one. And my sister, for the first time in my adult life, looked scared instead of superior. I need to tell you everything that happened after that moment. I need to tell you what was said when I finally stopped protecting everybody's carefully maintained lies. Because this story is not really about a picnic. It is not really about money. It is about what happens to a person when they spend years being the quiet one, the capable one, the one who handles things, and then one day they simply decide to stop. But before I go further, I want to ask you something. If you have ever been the person in your family who gives and gives and gives, and somehow ends up being the one everyone laughs at, I want you to stay with me through this, because I think something in this story is going to feel familiar to you in a way that might be uncomfortable. And I think that discomfort might be exactly what you need. My sister's name, for the purposes of this story, is Diane. She is 3 years older than me. She is the kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately reconfigures it around herself without anyone quite noticing how she did it. She has always been beautiful in the expensive, high-maintenance way that other people admire from a distance and fund up close. She has always known how to make her problems feel like opportunities for the people around her to prove their love. She has always been, in the language our family never used but always practiced, the one who needed more. I, on the other hand, had always been the one who needed less. Or at least, that was the story the family had agreed on. Claire is fine. Claire handles things. Claire doesn't make a fuss. Claire will figure it out. I had been given that identity so young and so consistently that I had spent most of my 20s confusing it with strength, not understanding until much later that it was just a more comfortable form of neglect. I worked 2 jobs. I restore damaged historical documents for the State Museum during the day, which means I spend my hours carefully preserving evidence, piecing together what actually happened from what remains after. Time and damage have done their work. At night, I work at a framing shop. I drive a 12-year-old car. I wear my hair simple and my clothes practical. I do not perform well for people who are not paying my bills. I made those choices deliberately after a broken engagement 2 years before the picnic, when I discovered that my former fiancé had quietly opened a credit card in both our names and expected me to absorb the debt because, as he put it, I was better with responsibility. I spent months after that rebuilding my finances and my capacity to trust anyone who asked me for something. Diane knew all of that. She knew exactly what that season had cost me. She had called me crying during it. She had told me she was sorry it happened. She had sat in my apartment and watched me sort through the financial damage and said more than once that I deserved better. And then she borrowed money from me 4 months later and started using my silence as building material for a better version of herself. The borrowing began in February of that year. She called me on a Tuesday evening and explained that her commission check had been delayed, that she was a little short, that she just needed something to tide her over until the end of the month. She asked me not to tell our parents, she said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down afterward. You're the only person I can ask who won't make me feel bad about it. I sent her $3,000 that night. In April, she called again. Her car needed a repair that her budget couldn't absorb right at that moment. $920. She would pay it back with her next check, she said. She just needed a bridge. In June, she called, because the rent on her downtown apartment was due and she was behind. And she did not want her fiancé, a man named Patrick who believed she was financially stable, to know $1,500. Please don't mention it to anyone. She was embarrassed. It was a one-time thing. Things were going to be different soon. In August, 2 weeks before the picnic, she needed $800 for a destination bachelorette trip she absolutely could not back out of, because appearances mattered, and she had already told everyone she was going, and what would people think if she suddenly couldn't afford it? I sent that one too. I sent all of them, and every time I did, I told myself it was because she was my sister, and sisters help each other, and this was temporary. I did not let myself look at the total, because looking at the total would have required me to have the conversation with myself that I was not ready to have, but I kept records. That is what museum work does to you. When you spend your professional life understanding that memory is unreliable and documentation is the only thing that survives intact through time, you stop treating your own memories as sufficient evidence of anything. I kept printed bank transfer records. I kept screenshots of her texts. I kept, in a small accordion folder in my tote bag, a handwritten note she had once left in my mailbox that said, "Please don't tell Mom and Dad I'm short on rent again. I'll pay you back as soon as things stabilize." I carried that folder to the picnic, not because I had planned what happened. I carried it because I had stopped trusting my family's version of history. An experience had taught me that when you stop trusting a story, you need to have the documents close. So when Diane made her toast, I was ready in a way she had not anticipated. Not emotionally ready, exactly, but factually ready. And in a room full of people who had spent years choosing feeling over fact. Facts were the most disruptive thing I could possibly bring. After I gave my countertoast and the yard went still, and her smile collapsed, Diane recovered quickly. That was always one of her great talents. She could fall on her face in public and within seconds make it look like the floor had been the aggressor. She gave a short, dismissive laugh. She touched the rim of her sunglasses in that practiced way she had. She said, "Wow, Claire, so we're doing this at a family picnic." Soft voice. Almost amused, the tone that communicates clearly to everyone watching that the person who responded is the real problem, not the person who started it. That had been the family pattern for as long as I could remember. Diane would cut, I would bleed, and then everyone would gather around, asking why I was making such a mess. I said, "You started it. Don't act shocked," that I finally answered. My mother, whose name is Ruth, leaned forward in that way she has when she wants to smooth something over without actually correcting the person who caused it. Her voice dropped into that particular soft register she reserves for moments she finds inconvenient. Girls. Not here. Not now. Not in front of people. That was always the operating rule when Diane crossed a line. The problem was never the wound. The problem was always that someone might see it bleeding. Diane shrugged with magnificent indifference. I was making a joke. You always do this. You turn everything into a crisis, because you're insecure. Some of my cousins looked away. Others watched with the specific fascination people reserve for car accidents on the highway. That terrible combination of wanting to look away and being completely unable to. I set my cup down on the table, before I could crush it in my hand. I said a joke. You borrowed $3,000 from me in February, because your commission check was delayed. You borrowed $920 in April for your car. You borrowed $1,500 in June, because the rent on your downtown apartment was due and you didn't want Patrick to know you were behind. Which part of that was the joke? Tell me specifically, because I would like to understand the punchline. Her face changed at the edges first. That was the tell with Diane. She had trained her mouth far better than her eyes. Her smile stayed up for one more second out of pure muscle memory, but the panic had already arrived in her expression, surfacing like something that had been underwater too long. You didn't have to say numbers, she said. Her voice had lost the casual ease. Exactly, I said. And you didn't have to toast me like I was a family charity case. We both made choices today. I'm just willing to be honest about mine. A low murmur moved down the length of the tables. My uncle, who had been turning corn on the grill with the focused attention of a man who wanted no part of what was happening, stopped, turning it. One of my younger cousins stared at Diane, with the particular wide-eyed expression children get when adults accidentally reveal that they are not gods after all. That the confidence and authority they project is just another kind of performance. My friend from work, a woman named Jenna, who had come because she thought a lakeside picnic sounded peaceful, stood near the drinks cooler with a paper plate in her hand, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as sudden understanding, like she had just been handed the key to 3 years of conversations I had never quite finished explaining. Diane crossed her arms. So now you want to meddle because you helped your sister a few times? I want basic respect, I said. That would have cost you considerably less. That one landed harder than I expected. Even my father, whose name is Gerald, shifted in his chair. He had spent years mistaking my silence for resilience. In his version of our family, because I handled things, I must not need anything. Because Diane announced her needs loudly and dramatically, she must need more. That is how some families divide love and attention. Not by fairness, not by equity, by who generates the most noise. Diane stepped closer to me. Tell them the rest, Claire. Tell them how you walk around acting like you're better than everyone because you have your sad little jobs, and your savings spreadsheets, and your thrift store clothes. You want everyone here to think you're some kind of saint. Fine. Tell them how impossible you are to be around. Tell them how you judge everyone. I laughed once. A genuine laugh, because the audacity of it was almost impressive. She had taken her complete financial dependence on me, and, in real time, in front of our entire family, translated it into my arrogance. I said, I restore damaged documents for the State Museum all day. Then I spend my evenings at a frame shop so that I can keep my own life stable without borrowing from people, and then humiliating them at family gatherings. I don't drink my paycheck. I don't lease things I can't afford. I don't insult the people who have been quietly covering for me. A different kind of quiet passed through the yard this time. Not empty. Heavy. The kind that arrives when a room full of people collectively realizes it has been listening to the wrong narrative for a very long time. Diane looked toward our parents, and I could see it clearly then. She was not angry anymore. She was looking for rescue, the way she had always looked for rescue, the way that had always worked before. People who feel powerful attack. People who feel exposed look for backup. My mother tried. Claire, sweetheart enough, but her voice had lost its authority. She sounded less like a parent redirecting her children, and more like someone quietly praying that a fire would have the decency to extinguish itself. My father cleared his throat. This doesn't need to become a spectacle. I turned to him and said, then why was everyone comfortable when I was the spectacle 5 minutes ago? He had nothing for that. He looked out toward the lake as if the light on the water might offer some kind of exit. Now, I need you to stay with me here, because what happened next is the part that changed everything. And if you've ever been in a family where one person keeps everyone's secrets while everyone else keeps their comfort, I think you're going to understand exactly why I did what I did next. My aunt, a woman I'll call Sheila, had been sitting at the far end of the table radiating supportive energy in Diane's direction all afternoon. She jumped in from her position of safety and said, your parents have always included you, Claire. They've always supported both of you equally. I said equally. That's interesting. And I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the accordion folder. My mother saw it and said sharply, Claire, don't. I said, today we do this properly. I opened the folder. I took out several printed sheets, bank transfer records, text message screenshots, and one handwritten note on pale yellow paper. I did not wave them in the air for effect. I did not shout. I understood instinctively that the moment I became emotional, everyone in that yard would use my emotion as permission to dismiss everything I was saying. I simply placed the papers on the table beside the bowl of potato salad. Gently, the way you place receipts on a counter when you know exactly what you paid and you are prepared to wait as long as necessary for the accounting to be done correctly. February 12th, I said. $3,000. Memo line. Temporary. Do not tell Mom and Dad. I paused. April 4th. $920. Car repair. I paused. June 21st. $1,500. Because Patrick thought you had already covered your half of the rent. I paused. August 2nd. $800. The destination bachelorette trip you absolutely could not back out of, because appearances mattered. Diane went white. Not the pink of embarrassment. White. Bloodless. One of my cousins whispered, "Oh my God," at a volume that carried to at least half the table. My Aunt Sheila stopped talking mid-breath. My father stared at the papers the way a person stares at something, written in a language they had spent years hoping never to have to learn. You kept receipts, Diane said. It came out very quiet. Of course I did, I said. You taught me to. That was the first truly honest sentence of the evening. I had not started my 20s suspicious. I became suspicious after too many stories changed when she retold them to other people. After too many favors I extended quietly became evidence of her generosity for allowing me to help. After too many humiliations arrived, wrapped in the packaging of jokes I was supposed to laugh along with, Jenna moved quietly from the cooler to stand near me. She did not touch me or interrupt. She just stood there, which was somehow more powerful than any speech she could have made. Her presence said, without a single word, "I see what is happening here, and I am not pretending otherwise." Diane looked at our parents again. "Are you really going to let her do this?" My father rubbed his hand across his jaw. He looked at Diane steadily and said, "Did you borrow this money?" She hesitated. That hesitation was all the answer anyone at that table needed. "That's private," she said finally. "I said it was private when I was protecting you. You made it public when you used me as a punchline." She stepped toward the papers and I put my hand flat over them. "Don't," I said quietly. "You have been rewriting me for years. You don't get to rewrite documents too." A few of my relatives looked down at that, and the ones who did looked ashamed. Not all of them. Some people will watch something unjust happen for a decade and still believe that the real offense is when the person being hurt finally finds the words to describe it clearly. But enough of them shifted that I could feel the balance of the yard changing beneath me. Diane felt it too. That was why her next move was the ugliest one of the evening. She looked directly at me and said, "Maybe, if you weren't so bitter about ending up alone, you wouldn't be this obsessed with money." She knew exactly where to aim. She knew about the engagement. She knew what that season had cost me, emotionally and financially. She knew I had spent months afterward rebuilding both my bank account and my ability to believe that anyone who asked me for something was not simply calculating what I could provide. She had held all of that information in her hands, like a stone she had been saving for the right moment. She used it there, between the paper plates and the lemonade pitchers, in front of 30 people. I looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I said, "That's fine. Keep going." Her chin came up slightly, mistaking my calm for weakness. "Really," she said. Tell them how miserable you are. Tell them why you can't stand watching other people be happy." "Happy," I said. "Diane, you're not happy. You're expensive. Those are two completely different things." That one froze the room again. My uncle coughed into his fist. One cousin did not successfully conceal a laugh. Diane heard both sounds, and the humiliation finally cracked through her composure entirely. "You jealous, bitter little Finish that sentence," I said. "And I'll read aloud the text message where you called me crying from a grocery store parking lot because your card was declined. And you wrote, 'Please answer. You're the only one who ever fixes this.'" She stopped. For the first time in my adult life, my sister had reached the edge of what performance could rescue. The performance had run out of road. I want to pause here and tell you something about humiliation inside families, because I think it matters. It rarely arrives as a single catastrophic event. It is almost never one spectacular cruelty that breaks a person. It is almost always years of small permissions. One mean joke that nobody corrects. One favor that goes unacknowledged and unrepaid. One daughter praised for her sparkle and another praised for her endurance, as though endurance is not simply neglected love that has learned to wear more practical shoes. Standing at that picnic table with printed bank records on a folding table, and my sister shaking with fury across from me, I understood something I had not fully understood before that moment. I was not ending a single argument. I was ending a role. The role of the family's quiet infrastructure, the one who holds the beams up so everyone else can enjoy the finished room. I looked at Diane and I said, "Here is what happens now. Since we all appear to enjoy public statements, let's make one that actually counts. From today forward, I am done. Done covering your rent, your emergencies, your image, and your debt. Done explaining you to people. Done absorbing what you create. Done." She gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being exact," I said. "Total unpaid amount, including the sum you promised to return last summer." I picked up the top sheet and held it so that the light hit it clearly. $7,280. My mother made a sound under her breath. My father looked at Diane with an expression I had genuinely never seen directed at her before. Not anger. Something worse than anger. A stunned, quiet disappointment that had nowhere comfortable to go. Diane saw it. It rattled her more visibly than anything I had said. "I was going to pay it back," she said. "When?" I asked. "After the next brunch. After the next luxury you can't actually afford. After the next time you post something about being blessed beyond measure while I'm covering your utilities." And that was the moment Patrick walked over from the grill. Patrick had been helping with the food all afternoon, staying carefully on the periphery of whatever was happening at the tables, in the way of a person who can feel a landmine field, and is choosing his steps very deliberately. He came over slowly. He stood for a moment, looking at the papers on the table, and he said quietly, "Wait. You told me your bonus covered the back rent." Diane turned toward him so fast, I thought she might lose her balance. "This is not the time," she said. Patrick said, "It seems like exactly the time." That single sentence changed the shape of everything that was happening. Until that moment, Diane had still been arguing with me, from whatever remained of her high ground. The assumption that her public image was still intact, that the story she had told about herself was still the one people believed. But now someone from inside her own carefully constructed life had discovered that the foundation of it was paper. He had been standing on scenery this whole time, and he was only just understanding that. "You lied to me," he said. "Don't do this here," she hissed. I almost felt something for her in that moment. Almost. But pity is a dangerous thing when you have spent years confusing it with love. And I had learned that lesson at significant personal expense. I said, "You lied to everyone, Diane. And every single time I stayed quiet, you used my silence as raw material. You built a better version of yourself out of it." She pointed at me. "You love this? You love making me look bad? I said. You did the looking bad part entirely on your own. I just stopped editing. That was the sentence I wished I had known at 25 instead of 34. I just stopped editing. That was all it had ever been. I was not the villain of her story. I was just the person who finally stopped softening the parts that were hard. My father stood up from his chair. He is not a physically large man, but in that moment he seemed older than I had ever seen him. Not weak, just tired. Tired in the specific way people look when they finally understand that their comfort has been financed by someone else's silence and patience and restraint. He said, Diane, is the number real? She said, it's not that simple. I said, that means yes. My Aunt Sheila made one final attempt to rescue the atmosphere. Families help each other, she said, from the safety of the far end of the table. I looked at her and said, families don't toast the person helping them and call it a joke. That was the last thing Sheila said all evening. Patrick stepped back from Diane, not dramatically, just enough to create a distance that had not existed between them 10 minutes earlier. He said quietly, you told me Claire was always asking for money. You told me she was irresponsible. Diane's mouth opened. Nothing came out that would have sounded believable. People began to move. Not dramatically, not in any organized way, but enough. A cousin who had been standing near Diane drifted quietly toward the drinks table. Sheila sat down and found something to study in her lap. My mother stopped, reaching for the smoothing voice. My father stopped defending the peace at any cost. Diane was still standing in the center of the yard, but she was, suddenly, genuinely alone in it. I gathered the papers back into a neat stack. I said, I'll send you a repayment schedule this evening. If you ignore it, I'll consider the money a lesson fee, and I will never answer another emergency call from you again. She stared at me. You cut off your own sister? I'd stop funding my own humiliation, I said. Then I looked at my parents, at both of them, and I said, and before either of you asks me to be the bigger person, don't I have been the bigger person for so long that you all mistook it for my permanent shape? Nobody spoke. The breeze off the lake moved the edge of the tablecloth. A paper napkin lifted and drifted and fell. Somewhere behind us one of the children asked if dessert was ready yet, which felt almost unbearably normal. That is what family ruptures are like. The world does not stop for them, it just reveals itself. People started leaving early after that. On any other occasion this would have devastated my mother. But that evening, she barely seemed to register it. A gathering built entirely on appearances cannot survive the truth for very long. As relatives folded their chairs and loaded their things into coolers and cars, I caught fragments of conversations I was not meant to hear. I had no idea. 7,000? She called. Claire broke. That's unbelievable. It was not everyone joining my side suddenly and completely. Real life does not move that cleanly or that fast. Some people still believed I had gone too far. Some people would always believe that maintaining public peace is more important than private fairness, because public peace is the thing that makes their own comfort possible. But the spell had broken, and once a family spell breaks, it almost never returns in exactly the same form. Patrick did not come back for nearly 40 minutes. He handed the grilling tongs to my father, said he was going to take a walk, and left without slamming anything, which somehow made it more final than any dramatic exit could have been. Diane watched him go, and for a moment she looked like she might follow him, and then she didn't, because there was no version of that departure that she could make look like anything other than what it was. I stood by the dock while the sky deepened into that particular shade of blue that makes everyone look softer than they actually are. Jenna came up beside me and handed me a bottle of water. She said, I used to think you were exaggerating, not about her exactly. About how alone you felt inside your own family. I took the bottle and nodded. Most people do not understand what it is to be the family scapegoat, unless they have lived it. The way the role is not assigned all at once, but accumulated over years, in small, deniable increments. The way it becomes invisible, even to the person wearing it. Jenna said, you were never broke, Claire. You were carrying people. I laughed quietly. I said that should be on a greeting card. but the truth of it settled into me harder than any joke. Because that was the insult at the center of everything, wasn't it? Broke. Not financially, though they had enjoyed pretending it was that simple. In their telling, I was broke because I drove a 12-year-old car, because I wore my hair simple, because I chose stability over spectacle after the engagement disaster, because I had learned the specific dignity of living within my actual means. To Diane, restraint looked like failure because she had never needed to develop a relationship with the concept of enough. I thought about a night 16 months before that picnic. Diane had called me crying from outside a boutique hotel downtown. She had been locked out after a birthday dinner. She was too embarrassed to ask Patrick for money. She was too proud to admit she had spent the rent. I drove 40 minutes in the rain. I brought her cash. I sat in my car while she went back inside and redid her lipstick in her compact mirror, and I listened to her promise me it was the last time. 2 days later, she posted photographs from that same dinner with the caption, "Blessed beyond measure." I had thought about that caption many times since then. I had tried to figure out what exactly she had meant to communicate with it, and I had eventually concluded that she had not been thinking about me at all when she wrote it. That was perhaps the most honest thing about her. She did not think about me when I was not in front of her, because the architecture of our relationship only required me to function as infrastructure. I held the invisible beams. She decorated the room. She entertained in it. She posed in it for photographs, and the beams never appeared in any of the pictures. By the time the last of the cousins had loaded their cars and driven away, the yard had the exhausted look of somewhere that had hosted more than it was designed for. Crushed cups in the grass, half a watermelon sweating on the table, a tray of dinner rolls gone stiff in the evening air. My parents were waiting for me by the patio, and I could tell from the particular shape of their silence that the second part of the evening had arrived. Not the public part, the honest part. Diane sat in a chair under the string lights with her arms wrapped around herself. She no longer looked glamorous. She looked cornered. I thought, good. And then I felt a half second of guilt about that thought before I let it go, because consequences always feel cruel to the people who have spent their lives expecting none. My father said, "Come sit down, Claire." I did not want to. Sitting down implies comfort, and I was not there to offer anyone comfort, but I pulled out a chair and faced them. Jenna squeezed my shoulder once before walking to her car, giving me the kind of quiet exit people give when they understand that the next conversation belongs entirely to blood and history and accumulated damage, and that there is no graceful role for a witness in it. My mother folded and unfolded a paper napkin in her lap. She said, "You blindsided us." It was such a specific kind of sentence. Not, "We failed you." Not, "We should have seen this coming." Blindsided us. As though the true injury of the evening had been their late arrival to information they should have demanded. "Years ago," I said. "I've been signaling for years. You just didn't want to receive it." My father looked at Diane. He said, quietly and without any softening whatsoever, "Go inside." She stared at him. "Why am I the only one being treated like I did something wrong?" He said, "Because tonight you did." It was small. It was overdue by approximately a decade, and it was the first time in my adult memory that he had said anything like it to her, without immediately cushioning it in explanation and qualification. Diane stood so abruptly, her chair scraped the patio stones. She looked at my mother for rescue, found none, and went inside. The screen door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. The sound hung in the air for a moment. My mother flinched. I did not. When the yard settled again, my father leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. He asked how long it had been going on. I said, "Depends what you mean." The borrowing, about 4 years. The insults, longer. The assumption that I'll absorb whatever she creates without complaint. Most of my adult life. My mother's eyes filled. She asked why I hadn't told them. I said, "I did. Just not in ways you chose to respect." I said I was tired. I said I couldn't keep doing it. I said her comments were cruel. Every time I was told she was stressed or sensitive, or didn't mean it, or that I was stronger and should let it go. You didn't hear me because the role you had given me was useful. It was convenient. It kept the peace you wanted to keep. That landed where it needed to. My parents had loved me. I genuinely believe that. But they had loved me lazily. They had loved the version of me that solved things, and absorbed things, and forgave things, and remembered birthdays, and brought side dishes and answered calls at 11 at night, and never once required that the emotional economy of the family be examined or justified. Once I stopped performing that version of myself, they were forced to sit across from the actual person. And she was tired in a way that could not be smoothed over or redirected. My mother said softly, "We thought Diane needed more support." "She's always been harder," I said. "That is not the compliment to me that you think it is. All it means is that you taught her that difficulty gets rewarded." My father shut his eyes for a moment. He said that I had always seemed easier, that I had never seemed to need managing. I said, "You managed me by giving me less. And I let you, because I didn't understand yet what I was agreeing to." Neither of them denied it. That was, I think, the first genuinely honest gift the evening produced. My mother looked at me with the raw, unguarded expression that parents sometimes have when they understand their children saw more of the machinery than they were supposed to see. She said, "We were proud of you. You were steady. You were capable. You never seemed like you needed rescuing." I said, "I didn't need rescuing. I needed fairness. I needed someone to notice that being dependable is not the same thing as being unaffected." My father asked if Diane had ever repaid any of it. I told him about the partial payments. Enough to maintain the fiction, never enough to change the relationship. I told him about the grocery store call, the hotel outside the birthday dinner, the time she asked me to book a room in my name because her card was declined and she didn't want Patrick to see the statement, the time she stood in my kitchen crying over a utility shut-off notice and posted the following day from a salon chair with fresh highlights and a caption about the importance of self-care. My mother covered her mouth. I said, "Do you know what hurt most tonight? Not the toast. Not even the laughter. It was realizing that you both laughed before you even checked to see how I was receiving it. It was understanding that somewhere in the years behind us, I became the person in this family that was safe to disrespect. And neither of you noticed, because it was so much more comfortable not to." My mother started crying then. Not the wounded, defensive kind of crying. The real kind. The kind that happens when a person's self-image cracks and there is nobody to blame for the sound of it. She said, "I'm sorry. I am so sorry." My father's voice was rough when he spoke. He said, "I should have shut that toast down the second it started." I said, "You should have." He nodded. He said, "You're right." Those two words changed something in the air between us. My entire life, peace in that family had required me to swallow truths faster than other people produced problems. Hearing him say I was right, without immediately moving to excuse or contextualize Diane's behavior, felt genuinely disorienting. Like a room I had been in so many times suddenly having a window I had never noticed before. My mother wiped her face and asked what I needed from them now. That was the best question of the evening, the first one in hours that had placed my reality at its center, instead of someone else's comfort. I said, "First, stop asking me to take calls for her, lend money, smooth things over, or translate Diane to herself. Second, don't ask me to forgive quickly, because the atmosphere is uncomfortable. Third, if she says something cruel to me in front of you, I need you to address it immediately, not afterward, not when it's convenient, in the moment. Fourth, don't confuse the fact that I show up for this family with an unlimited obligation to absorb whatever this family produces." My mother nodded. My father nodded. He said, "That's fair." I said, "It's necessary." He asked if I wanted them to make Diane repay me. I thought about it for a moment. Genuinely, I said, "Yes, but not because I need every dollar to keep my life running. I need it because the debt is the physical record of years of being used and lied about. I need it acknowledged, formally, because that acknowledgement is the only thing that makes the rest of what happened here real." My father leaned back. He said, "Then that's what happens. She repays you. If her lifestyle needs to change to make that possible, then her lifestyle changes." My mother said, very quietly, "No more rescuing." There was a long silence after that, But it was not the old kind of silence, the kind stuffed full of avoidance and performance. This one had something actual inside it. Work, the beginning of something honest. My mother said finally, I think we made a habit of admiring Diane's shine and depending on your structure. I looked at her and said, that is the most accurate thing you've said all year. She almost laughed. My father did laugh once, bitterly. He said structure doesn't sparkle, so we took it for granted. I said, exactly. I folded my hands in my lap so they would not see them shaking. Standing up publicly had run on adrenaline. This was running on something else entirely. Private truth runs on grief, and I was beginning to feel the weight of all of it settling. I said, I love you both. I want to say that clearly, so there is no confusion about what comes next. I love you, but I am not doing this anymore. If the only way to remain close to this family is to keep being diminished inside it, then distance will be healthier for me than closeness. And I am choosing my health. My mother reached for my hand. She stopped halfway, asking the question without words. I let her take it. Not because everything was resolved. Nothing was resolved. But because I understood something in that moment that I had not understood before. Boundaries are not walls when they are used correctly. They are doors. Doors with locks. And for the first time in my adult life, I was the one holding the key. Diane came back outside 20 minutes later. Her mascara had traveled. Her anger had been rearranged into something that looked more like wounded pride, which is what anger becomes when it no longer has a credible target. Patrick was with her, but he stood slightly apart from her, as though the physical proximity that had been automatic all day had become a decision he was now consciously making in a different way. My parents looked at her differently. That was the quiet miracle of the evening. Not that they had stopped loving her. Parents almost never stop loving their children, regardless of what those children do. The miracle was that love had finally, for the first time I could remember, stopped blinding them. My father said, sit down. She sat. No performance, no dramatic sigh, just a rigid, reluctant drop into the chair across from us. The posture of someone who has run out of comfortable options. My mother said, you owe Claire an apology. Diane gave a short laugh that contained no humor whatsoever. So, this is a tribunal now? I said, no, it's the first honest conversation this family has had about your behavior in years. You're welcome to participate or not. But the accounting is already done. She looked at me with naked resentment. You humiliated me. You announced my financial situation in front of 30 people. My father said, and all four of us turned slightly, because he almost never interrupted her. You humiliated her first, in front of those same 30 people. It was not a joke. It was mean. And you knew exactly what you were doing when you did it. Diane stared at him, as though he had begun speaking a language she did not recognize. My mother added, and the money is not a misunderstanding between sisters. It is debt, that is what it is called. I watched that word land on Diane. Debt, not favor, not support, not a temporary inconvenience between people who love each other. Debt, a single word that stripped years of comfortable storytelling down to the bones of what had actually been happening. She looked at Patrick. He had nothing ready for her. He asked, quietly, did you tell Mara's sister she covered the rent? She said nothing. He asked, did you tell your parents that Claire was the one always asking for help? Still nothing. His voice did not rise. It hardened. He said, did you? She muttered something. No one moved for a moment. My father said, you will repay Claire every dollar. We will help you build a plan to do that, but we are not paying it for you. Diane's head came up sharply. You'd make me struggle over this. My mother said, no, we are making you face what you created. I want you to understand what it meant to hear my mother say that. She had spent the better part of 2 decades buffering consequences before they could reach Diane. She had smoothed and explained and contextualized and redirected. Hearing her stop, hearing her say with complete clarity that Diane needed to face what she had created, felt like hearing a door that had been stuck for years finally move on its hinges. Diane turned to me. Fine, take your money, if it means that much to you, I said. It does not because I worship money, because I respect effort. Every dollar you borrowed casually and spent on appearances cost me hours of my life that you never once thought to value." She rolled her eyes, weaker now. "You always have to turn everything into some kind of moral statement," I said. "Life turned it into one. I'm just finally saying it out loud." Patrick said he was going home. Diane looked at him with an expression of complete disbelief. He said he didn't know which part was worse, the debt, the lying, or the way she had publicly destroyed the person who had quietly been covering for her. He looked at my parents and said he was sorry this had happened here. He looked at me and said he was sorry he had believed it. And then he left, without slamming anything, which made it more final than any dramatic exit could have achieved. Diane watched him go. She stood as if to follow him, then stopped, because there was no version of that departure she could make look like anything other than its own consequence. My father gestured to the chair. She sat back down. "My mother said you were going to apologize to your sister. Properly." Diane looked at me. Her eyes were wet, not with the tears of someone who was sorry, with the tears of someone who was being forced to see themselves clearly for the first time in a very long time, and did not like what the light revealed. She said, flatly, "I'm sorry." My father shook his head. He said, "Try again." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, her voice was different, lower, less polished, something underneath the performance, something I had not heard from her in years. She said, "I'm sorry I used you. I'm sorry I kept taking what you gave and then treating you like you were beneath me for giving it. I'm sorry I lied to Patrick. I'm sorry I made you look like the problem in the story where you were the only person trying to hold anything together." The yard was very quiet. The string lights hummed softly above us. The lake moved in the darkness beyond the grass. One of the children had fallen asleep inside, and someone had left the kitchen light on. I looked at my sister for a long moment. I did not tell her it was fine, because it was not fine. I did not tell her I forgave her, because forgiveness is not a thing that can be produced on demand at a patio table. I said, "I heard you," and I meant it. I had heard her. The real sentence, the one underneath the performance. And I filed it carefully, the way I filed everything that mattered, in a place where I could return to it later and examine what it actually meant. I drove home that night in my 12-year-old car, through streets that looked completely ordinary, because they were. That is the strange thing about days that change things. The world around them stays entirely the same. The gas stations are lit. The traffic lights cycle. People are walking dogs and ordering food and having completely unremarkable evenings. And you are driving through all of it carrying something that has fundamentally shifted inside you, something that is going to take a very long time to fully understand. I had not gone to that picnic planning to do what I did. I had not rehearsed the countertoast, or packed the folder as part of the strategy. I had simply reached a point where the accumulated weight of years of small permissions had finally exceeded what I could continue to carry quietly, and something in me had decided, without exactly consulting the rest of me first, that the quiet was over. What I know now, some months after that evening, is this: the repayment is ongoing. It is slow, and it is not without friction, but it is happening. My parents and I are in the early, careful stages of building a different kind of relationship, one that does not require me to be the infrastructure, and them to be the ones who enjoy the room. It is uncertain work. Honest things usually are. Diane and I are not close. I do not know if we will be. I am not in a hurry to find out. And I have made peace with that uncertainty in a way that would not have been possible for me a year ago. What I want to leave you with is the thing Jenna said to me by the dock, because I have thought about it almost every day since. She said, "You are never broke. You are carrying people." If you are someone who recognizes that sentence, if you heard it just now and felt something move in your chest because you know exactly what it is to carry people who would never think to ask how heavy it has gotten, I want you to hear me say this directly to you. The weight is not a virtue. Being able to carry it does not mean you are supposed to. And putting it down is not abandonment. It is just finally, after all this time, deciding that you are also worth the effort of being carried. If this story found you at the right moment, I want you to tell me in the comments. Tell me if you have been the quiet one. Tell me if you have been the infrastructure while someone else decorated the room. Tell me what it felt like when you finally said enough. I read every single comment. I want to know where this story lands and what it opens up in you. And if you are new here, if this video somehow made its way to you through the strange and particular logic of the internet that brings us exactly what we need at exactly the right time, I want you to know that this is the kind of story we tell. Here, real ones, complicated ones, the kind that do not resolve neatly or quickly but resolve honestly. If that is something you want more of, the subscribe button is right there, and I would genuinely love to have you stay. There is more to tell. There are things that happened in the weeks after that picnic that I have not told anyone yet. Things my mother said to me privately that changed the way I understood my entire childhood. Something Diane sent me in a message at 2 a.m, 3 weeks after that evening, that I have read probably 40 times since. And a conversation with my father that I am still, honestly, trying to make sense of. If you want to hear all of it, stay close. And if this story felt like something true to you, share it with someone who needs it. You probably already know who that person is.